The decision from Maine Secretary of State to remove Donald Trump from the Republican primary ballot is drawing harsh criticism and calls for an appeal. In statements to the Portland Press-Herald, the GOP leader in the Maine House called it a sham decision and warned it will not stand legal scrutiny. The state's Republican Senate leader says the decision undermines democracy and Maine voters deserve a primary process that allows for each party to decide its own candidates. The Maine GOP has said it will appeal that decision. Here's what the party chairman told CNN last night.
She has kicked a serious hornet's nest. I've heard just in the last couple of hours from so many independents, Democrats, and Republicans alike, this isn't about Donald Trump. This is about our constitutional rights and the ability of the American people to elect into leadership the people that they choose.
And Maine Secretary of State Shanna Bellows joins us now. Good to have you with us this morning. I'm sure you had already seen and heard much of that criticism and more. How do you respond this morning?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I think it's really important that people understand the process. As a general matter, states have the power to control their own ballots and in fact do under the Constitution. And Maine law specifically delegates to me as Secretary of State a requirement to review the qualifications for any candidate running for office. So for example, last week, the Superior Court found that my decision to bar Mr. Chris Christie from Maine's presidential primary ballot due to lack of signatures was lawful and correct. So my job, I qualify Mr. Trump for the ballot, and under Maine law, any registered voter can bring a challenge to that qualification. In this case, there were 3 challenges, and I was required by law to hold a hearing, an administrative hearing, to review the evidence, hear testimony. Both sides were represented by counsel. Mr. Trump was represented by an attorney, and then I'm required to issue a decision. That's my obligation under the oath I swore to the Constitution.
In terms of the criticism that your decision takes away the right for voters to have their voice heard, do you believe that's a valid concern?
Again, my first and foremost obligation is my oath to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. Now, different states are different. For example, in neighboring New Hampshire, there are more than a dozen candidates on the Democratic presidential ballot, but Mr. Joseph Biden is not on the Democratic presidential primary ballot in New Hampshire, and there are more than a dozen Republican candidates. In Maine, there are 2 candidates on the Democratic presidential primary ballot and less than a dozen Republican presidential candidates. So every state is different. My obligation and duty, my sole consideration, is my oath to uphold the Constitution.
As you note in laying out there how things do work in Maine, given the amount of pushback you've seen, though, to doing your job as it's laid out in the state constitution, do you anticipate there could be a legislative challenge in the future to the duties of the Secretary of State in Maine?
So again, with the process, this decision now goes to the Superior Court and then can go to the Maine
But I mean
Supreme
specifically
Judicial Court
with your role, not in the way that this lays out Maine state law, but given the pushback that you're hearing, including from folks in your own state who know what your role is and what the state constitution of Maine lays it out to be in the state, do you anticipate that there could be some sort of a legislative challenge to that role or even to the state constitution?
So the legislature can always change the laws. I would be surprised if they directed me to stop enforcing qualifications for office. Some have suggested, for example, that I can't enforce age or residency or citizenship qualifications or the 22nd Amendment. I don't think that I'm permitted to put an 18-year-old on the ballot or a non-citizen on the ballot. My job is to look at the qualifications, and if those qualifications are challenged, to make a determination, but there's also a court process. The legislature, if they change that, I will absolutely adhere and follow the law.
In your decision, you argue that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. You did hold a public hearing ahead of the decision. It's interesting to note Democratic Congressman from Maine, Jared Golden, said in a statement in response to this decision, quote, until he's actually found guilty of the crime of insurrection, he should be allowed on the ballot. Did that consideration weigh on your decision or give you any pause?
I reviewed Section 3 of the 14th Amendment very carefully and determined that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does not say conviction, it says engage. And let's go back and keep in mind that the events of January 6, 2021 were unprecedented and tragic. This was an attack not only on the Capitol and the government officials, the former vice president, members of Congress, but an attack on the rule of law. And the weight of evidence that I reviewed indicated that it was in fact an insurrection, and Mr. Trump engaged in that insurrection under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
We are waiting to see if the Supreme Court will in fact take up this Colorado case. I know you mentioned the Colorado case in your decision. When you look at where things stand, there is a question, our own senior legal analyst bringing this up. He doesn't believe that if the Supreme Court takes this up, that they will in fact rule on what engaging in an insurrection means, whether there needs to be criminality with it. If they do not, are you concerned about the fallout?
I will always implement what the court decides. And this type of proceeding is not unusual as part of my duties in Maine under Maine election law. In 2022, for example, I held a similar hearing on the qualifications of a district attorney candidate, found him unqualified. That was appealed. The court upheld my ruling. I mentioned Mr. Chris Christie just last week, the Superior Court finding that I had made the right decision in barring him from the ballot under Maine law. But I will always uphold what the court does, and it's part of the job of being Secretary of State. Should the U.S. Supreme Court rule that Mr. Trump be on the ballot, I will in fact place him on the ballot. It's part of why I suspended the effect of my decision until the courts can act. So no ballots are being printed until that Superior Court decision or Supreme Court decision might come down. Although we're looking at a very tight time frame.
Joining me right now from Kittery, Maine is NBC's Emma Barnett. Emma, welcome back. And I want to tell our viewers who may have seen you an hour ago not being able to continue with your reporting that you're safe and sound. It's all good. So let's get to what you have to tell us. I'm curious how voters in Maine are feeling about this decision to take former president off of their primary ballot.
Hey, Alex, thank you so much. And yes, I am safe. All is good. But let's jump in and talk about Section 3, Amendment 14 of the Constitution. What that means is it basically says that anyone who has incited an insurrection cannot hold public office. And back in September, my colleague Nnamdi Igwanwu and I called all 50 chief election officials and the one in D.C. too to see what they were going to do about these challenges that were popping up across the country. And all of them, or most of them, I should say, had a similar sentiment, which is wait and see what the courts decide. Now, in Maine, the Secretary of State on Thursday made the decision that she wants to keep Trump off the ballot. And the reasoning for that is Section 3, Amendment 14. She believes that Trump's actions on January 6th make him ineligible to run for president. And as you mentioned, she has received threats for doing so. And Trump and his legal team are appealing the cases both in Maine and Colorado. And I want you to take a listen to what some Maine locals have to say about what she did.
I have very mixed feelings about it. He certainly is not qualified to be president, but at the same time, there's a lot of people that support him. And I think it causes more distrust in the voting process to take him off the ballot.
It's unconstitutional because she's charging him with insurrection, and it hasn't been proven. He hasn't pled guilty to insurrection. He hasn't been charged properly with insurrection, so she's stepped over her boundary.
I think that it's justified, and I'm glad to see now, finally, we're getting a little more publicity around the fact that we do actually have constitutional amendment that talks about insurrectionists not holding office. Such a good idea.
Alex, so as you can see, a lot of mixed opinions here in Maine, and it is highly anticipated that the Supreme Court is going to take up this issue because of how consequential it is.
Yeah, well, for the past year, words like sedition, treason, insurrection have been used to describe what happened on January 6th. Yet, none of the hundreds of people charged in connection with January 6th have been charged with those specific crimes.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard today. I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to respect our great people in law and order. We don't want anybody hurt. It's a very tough period of time, There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel, but go home and go home in peace.